Have you ever heard a story from history that it doesn't seem real? A moment where the math just doesn't add up, where everything we think we know about logic and strategy gets thrown right out the window? Well, we're about to dive into one of those moments. It's a story so unbelievable, it honestly feels like it was ripped from a Hollywood script. This is the story of a tiny, mismatched group of American ships that did the one thing nobody expected. They charged straight into the teeth of the most powerful naval force on the entire planet.
All right, so here's how we're going to break down this absolutely insane story. First, we'll look at the brilliant trap the Japanese Navy set, a true masterpiece of a plan. Then, we'll be right there in the cockpit for the heart-stopping moment an enemy fleet appears out of nowhere. We'll follow the desperate, almost suicidal charge of the small boys, dive into the chaos of the battle itself, and then witness the miraculous turn of events that nobody saw coming. And finally, we'll talk about why this battle and the sacrifices made still matter so much today.
So, to really get the sheer desperation of what happened at Samar, you first have to appreciate the genius of the Japanese plan. This wasn't just a simple attack. It was a complex, multi-layered gamble called Shō-Go 1, and it had one single brutal goal: to completely annihilate the American invasion force at Leyte Gulf. On paper, it was flawless. Think of it like a magician's trick. The key was misdirection. The Japanese sent a fleet of their aircraft carriers, which were basically empty shells with very few planes or pilots left, to act as bait. Their mission was simple: get spotted, look like a huge threat, and lure the main American fighting force, the powerful Third Fleet, away on a wild goose chase. And while the Americans were busy chasing these ghost carriers, two actual Japanese fleets, bristling with the biggest battleships in the world, would sneak through unguarded straits and just massacre the unprotected American landing ships. And the bait worked. It worked perfectly. The American commander, Admiral Halsey, got a report that a key part of the Japanese force was retreating. At the same time, his plane spotted the decoy carriers. He saw a golden opportunity to wipe out the last of Japan's carriers in one glorious battle. So, he made the fateful call. He took his entire fleet, all of his powerful battleships and carriers, and steamed north as fast as he could. He left the back door, the San Bernardino Strait, completely and utterly unguarded. Now look at this. This slide shows you what was left behind to guard 130,000 troops, a tiny little task unit with the codename Taffy 3. Look at what they've got. 6 escort carriers. These are not the big, fast armored carriers. These are slow, thin-skinned ships built on cargo ship hulls. They're nicknamed jeep carriers. They had just 3 destroyers and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. And who were they up against? The main Japanese center force, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the biggest, baddest battleship ever built. This isn't just a mismatch. This is a pack of wolves descending on a flock of sheep. Okay, so let's put ourselves in the moment. It's just before dawn, October 25th, 1944. For the men of Taffy 3, it's just another morning at war. A young pilot, Ensign William Brooks, is up in his plane on a routine anti-submarine patrol. And then, through the haze, he sees something on the horizon. Something that, according to every intelligence report, should not be there. Something impossible. Back on the American flagship, his first report was dismissed. They thought he was just a confused young pilot. But then his voice crackled over the radio again, with these words: "Pagoda masts." That was the dead giveaway. That was the unique, unmistakable silhouette of a Japanese warship. And not just any warship. He was looking at the Yamato. The boogeyman was real. The Japanese fleet hadn't retreated at all. It was here, and it was bearing right down on them.
On the American flagship, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague had maybe 30 seconds to process this nightmare and react. There was no time to write up a fancy battle plan. He just barked out 4 commands born of pure survival instinct. 1. Turn towards that rainstorm over there for cover. 2. Launch every single plane you've got right now. I don't care what bombs they have on them, just get them in the air. 3. Get every ounce of speed out of these engines. And 4. Get those little escort ships to lay down a smokescreen. This wasn't a plan to win. It was a plan to live for 5 more minutes.
And now we get to the part of the story that just breaks every rule in the book. The small boys, the destroyers and destroyer escorts, they're hopelessly outgunned, they're slower, running isn't an option. So what do you do when you are faced with certain absolute annihilation? The commanders of these little tin can ships made a decision that is still studied in awe. They turned towards the enemy. Before a fleet-wide order was even given, Commander Ernest Evans of the destroyer USS Johnston just
acted. He turned his ship and charged, by himself, straight at the enemy fleet. And you have to understand, this wasn't just a heat-of-the-moment decision. This was who this man was. A year earlier, when he first took command of the Johnston, he told his crew what you see on the screen. He promised them they would be a fighting ship. On this morning, he made good on that promise. And he was not alone. Over on the tiny destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, a ship so small it was nicknamed a DE, its captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, got on the ship's intercom, and he gave his men one of the most brutally honest speeches in military history. He offered no false hope. He told them the cold, hard truth. We are probably all going to die. Our mission is to do as much damage as we possibly can before they sink us. And with that, his crew went to work, ready to fight to the end. What happens next is just 2.5 hours of pure, unadulterated chaos. The small boys threw themselves at these Japanese giants. Their goal wasn't to sink battleships. They knew they couldn't. Their goal was to be so aggressive, so annoying, so completely unpredictable that they could sow confusion and buy their little carriers a few more precious minutes to escape. And just to really put this in perspective, I want you to look at this number. 3,220 pounds. That's the weight of a single artillery shell from the Yamato's main guns. A single shell. It's literally the weight of a small car being hurled at you from over 20 miles away. And the American destroyers, they had hulls that were about half an inch thick. A single hit should have just vaporized them. The fight was just a blur of these incredible moments of bravery. The Johnston charges in, gets close enough to fire its torpedoes and cripple a heavy cruiser. Then it gets absolutely pulverized by battleship shells. But even with half its crew dead or wounded, its engines wrecked, it just keeps shooting. The tiny Samuel B. Roberts gets so close to a cruiser, it's firing its anti-aircraft guns at the bridge before it lands a fatal torpedo. And all this time, American pilots with no bombs left are making fake attack runs, diving on these massive ships just to make the gunners flinch and draw their fire. It was absolute, calculated madness. So yeah, this chart makes it painfully obvious this was never a fight about firepower. The Yamato alone could throw more weight in a single salvo than all of Taffy 3's destroyers combined. This battle wasn't won with guns or steel. It was won with a bluff, a massive psychological bluff played by men who had nothing left to lose. And here is exactly why that bluff worked. The Americans completely broke the Japanese military rulebook. Japanese naval doctrine said that a weaker force, when confronted, retreats and maneuvers carefully. The Americans did the exact opposite. They charged. Their actions were so irrational, so suicidal, that it planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the Japanese commanders. They thought, no one would fight like this. This has to be a trap. The main American fleet must be hiding just over the horizon, waiting to pounce. And that confusion, that doubt, leads us to the moment that still has historians scratching their heads. The American ships were shattered. The Johnston was sinking. The Samuel B. Roberts was sinking. The path to the landing ships was wide open. Victory was right there for the taking. And then the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, gave an order that nobody could believe. Aboard the American flagship, a signalman was staring through his binoculars, just waiting for the end, and he saw the giant Japanese warships start to turn. He was so stunned, he just shouted out for everyone to hear. They weren't attacking anymore, they were leaving. They were getting away. So why? Why on earth did he turn back? Because the bluff worked beyond anyone's wildest dreams. The relentless destroyer charges, the non-stop air attacks from pilots who kept coming back even with empty guns. It all combined to completely shatter Admiral Kurita's picture of the battle. He was convinced he had stumbled into a massive trap, and fearing for the rest of his fleet, he made the call to withdraw and regroup. You'd think the story would end there, but there was one last, cruel twist. As the sailors of Taffy 3 were just starting to process that they had survived, a new threat appeared in the sky. It was the first organized kamikaze attack of the war, planes deliberately crashing themselves into ships. One of them hit the escort carrier USS St. Lo. It erupted into flames and sank in under 30 minutes, a horrifying preview of the final, brutal months of the war. So when the smoke finally cleared, Taffy 3 was still there. Battered, broken, but alive. The cost, though, was immense. And that brings us to the real question. Why does this one battle, in a war filled with so many, still echo through history with such power? Let's look at the price of that impossible victory. The butcher's bill was staggering. 5 American ships went to the bottom. The destroyers Johnston and Hoole. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts. The escort carriers Gambier Bay and St. Lo. And nearly every other ship in the task force was heavily damaged. For hundreds of survivors, the fight was just beginning, as they'd spend the next 2 days in shark-infested waters waiting to be rescued.
And here is the ultimate cost, but also the ultimate meaning of their sacrifice. Over 1,100 men were killed or went missing in action in just a few hours. But they didn't die for nothing. Their sacrifice directly stopped the most powerful surface fleet in the Japanese Navy from reaching the landing beaches. They saved 130,000 U.S. troops from what would have been an absolute slaughter. In the end, this quote from the great naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison really says it all. This battle wasn't about technology or tactics. It was about pure human will. It's this timeless, unbelievable story of how a small group of people, faced with impossible odds, can literally change the course of history. And it leaves us with this powerful question, doesn't it? What is it inside of us that allows ordinary people to summon that kind of extraordinary courage when everything is on the line?